First Vatican Council was one of the most significant moments in the history of Christianity. It's remembered as the council that defined papal infallibility, but that's really only a part of the story. Taken as a whole, it's a tale of vibrant characters vying to shape a church at a crossroads, caught between the authority of its past and the uncertainties of the modern world. In this video, I want to take you inside that story, not just looking at the conclusions the council came to, but how it got there, and perhaps most importantly, what that means for us today. It was 1869. Europe was in flux. Empires were rising and falling, science was galloping forward, and the old alliances between throne and altar, pulpit and lectern were beginning to crumble. For over 300 years, the Council of Trent had stood as the final word in dogmatic theology. But in a world now teeming with Darwin, Marx, and German biblical criticism, that silence was becoming deafening. Enter Pope Pius IX. He was the longest reigning pope in history, and one of the most controversial. As the spiritual leader of the church and political head of the papal states, his reign had been plenty eventful even before the council that would solidify his place in history. By the late 1860s, he had already declared the Immaculate Conception of Mary dogma and survived the shockwaves of the 1848 revolutions. Now, he summoned the world's bishops to Rome for something the church had not attempted since the Reformation: an ecumenical council. Vatican I was born in Crises. If you know nothing else about the context of the council, it should be this. The crises that shaped the council came on many fronts: political, social, and ideological. Let's start with the crisis of ideas. The universities that had once served as bastions of Catholic thought were now breeding grounds for what the church authorities saw as dangerous skepticism. The rise of historical criticism, especially in Germany, was unsettling the foundations of faith. Scholars began putting scripture under the microscope of historical analysis as they would any other ancient text. And before long, this led to academics questioning long-held beliefs about the historical accuracy of the Gospels. Rather than accepting their claims on faith, figures like David Friedrich Strauss were scandalizing people by saying that the Gospels presented the mythical aspirations of the early Christian communities rather than real history. The term for this new methodology was Wissenschaft, a rigorous critical pursuit of knowledge that emphasized evidence over tradition. Rationalists had questioned miracles before, but that was different for two reasons. First, these rationalist critiques were based on philosophy, and the church was well equipped to argue on that front thanks to centuries of philosophical refinement. Second, those critiques usually came from outside the church and could be easily dismissed as the ravings of heretics. This new methodology, however, focused on dispassionate historical analysis, and even more troubling, it soon found its champion within the church itself. That man was Ignaz von Dollinger, a Bavarian priest, historian, and kind of a reluctant revolutionary. To many, he was a hero. He was one of the finest church historians of his time, deeply committed to Catholicism, while also being convinced it needed reform. Dollinger dreamed of a theology that would integrate modern scholarship, engage separated Christian communities, and transcend the rigid categories of scholasticism. But his vision was not universally shared. Where some saw critical scholarship as a great tool to enliven and refine faith, others saw in it a great threat. These were uncertain times for the church and the world, and the solution, at least in the mind of some, was to give the faithful firmer confidence in the faith. That's what Vatican I was meant to do. And for some, there would be no better way of assuring the foundations of the faith than defining papal infallibility as dogma. Those in favor of papal infallibility were part of a movement known as Ultramontanism. These figures wanted a strong church government centralized in the infallible pope. No man worked harder to make sure the council did that than Dollinger's great opponent, the English Cardinal Henry Edward Manning. For him, the time was ripe for the church to declare the pope's infallibility and draw a line in the sand against the liberal tides of the day. Which brings us to the council itself. Now, despite much more ambitious plans, Vatican I only produced two major documents, in part because the process was a lot slower than they anticipated, and also in part due to external factors that led to the council being disbanded for safety reasons with the invasion of the Papal States. The first of these two texts is titled Dei Filius, which is Latin for the Son of God. Though often overshadowed by Pastor Aeternus, the document on papal infallibility, this document lays the groundwork for what follows. Indeed, they both can be seen as attempts to meet the challenge of modernity, and to understand the latter, you've got to understand the former. Dei Filius was essentially a document about the relationship between faith and reason, set against the backdrop of a world where reason was threatening to overtake faith. The stakes were high. The document began as a lengthy academic treatise specifically aimed at responding to the trends in German universities, from people like Ignaz von Dollinger. In time, though, the bishops whittled it down and shaved off some of the more polemical edges of the initial draft. While some bishops still felt unease over the document's implications for academic freedom, for the most part, Dei Filius passed without too much strife. The final document had 4 chapters, which covered 1. God as the creator of all things, 2. Divine revelation, 3. Supernatural faith, and 4. The relationship between faith and reason. Throughout them, you can see a concerted effort to reassert the necessity of a supernatural worldview. Furthermore, you can see a direct challenge to any who said that reason could triumph over faith. On the latter, we see 4 critical ideas. 1. Reason and faith are fundamentally compatible. 2. Any assertion contrary to faith is totally false. 3. God's existence can be known with certainty by reason, but salvation requires faith. And 4. The meaning of dogmas does not, and indeed cannot, change. This was a carefully calibrated response to what church authorities saw as creeping relativism. But it also raised concerns. Like, what counts as certainty? Where do we draw the line between matters of faith and matters of science? And what does it mean to say doctrine never changes when history seems to tell a more complex story? This last question was particularly important. Few in the Catholic Church were denying the traditional idea of the existence of God, the fact of divine revelation, or the general compatibility of faith and reason. Even bishops who were opposed on other things generally agreed on those. But there was a sense that the refinements of historical knowledge and the application of scientific methods to theology could allow us to better understand previous church teachings and let them evolve in line with our new understanding. One man whose shadow loomed over this debate was John Henry Newman. Though he wasn't present at the council, his essay on the development of Christian doctrine had already become a touchstone in Catholic theology at the time. In it, Newman argued that doctrines grow over time, not by distortion, but by organic development, like a seed becoming a tree. For some, this was the key to improving on past doctrines. Dei Filius didn't name Newman directly, but its rejection of reinterpretation sent a clear signal. Development, while perhaps okay, needed to have limits. I want to pause real quick to say if you enjoy videos like this, please consider supporting this channel by becoming a patron. Videos like this take a ton of time and research to make, not to mention all that goes into editing them and getting them out there for you to see. And I can only do that because of the generous support of my patrons who give me the time, space, and resources to be able to make this channel what it is, a place where people can find goodness, truth, and beauty in the Christian tradition. So if you want to join in that mission and help support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. And when you do, as a thank you, you'll get tons of really fun perks. My favorite is access to the Gospel Simplicity Book Club, where we meet bi-weekly to read classic texts from the Church Fathers together, not just learning from these ancient, wise writers, but also from one another. It's been an absolutely fantastic experience for me. We've been through something like 8 books, and I can't wait to continue it. We'll be starting a new one here in the fall. So if you want to join that and you want to support the channel, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. And for those of you that already do, thank you so much. While debates over Dei Filius were tense at times, they paled in comparison to the drama brought on by Pastor Aeternus. Now, to fully appreciate this pivotal moment in church history, we have to look at the context that led to it. For this, we'll now see the political and social crises that cultivated the council. Perhaps more than anything, we have to bear in mind the seismic changes brought about by the French Revolution that had far-reaching implications for the church. Take this for just one example. In 1750, there were 25,000 monasteries, convents, and houses of religious orders in Europe, with approximately 350,000 members. By 1815, there were only a handful left. As the French military spread across Europe, so too did its anti-monastic policies, and subsequent revolutions were no friends of the church generally, either. After the downfall of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna sought to restore traditional powers in Europe. This was a welcome change for most Catholics. While the revolutionary mantras of liberty, fraternity, and equality had inspired utopian visions for some, most Catholics at the time saw rising liberalism as a destabilizing anti-Christian movement that needed to be stopped. Just as European nations needed to return to the stability of absolute monarchies, so too did the Church need a strong central leader in the Pope. Thus, for some figures like the influential French layman Joseph de Maistre, The arguments for papal infallibility were primarily socio-political ones. In other words, the solution to the church's problems were the same as the solutions to the state's problems. For others, the issue was more about certainty. As we've mentioned, it wasn't only empires that were rising and falling, but ideologies as well. Papal infallibility could serve as a bulwark against such things. One famous English ultramontanist, William George Ward, famously said that he'd like an infallible papal encyclical delivered to him every morning at breakfast with the Times. Critically, the ultramontanists were masters of the press. Between the trauma of the revolutions and the voluminous literary output of its proponents, ultramontanism was reaching a fever pitch by the time of the council. But it wouldn't be fair to merely reduce papal infallibility to pro-monarchy or pro-certainty movements of the time. From a theological standpoint, ultramontanists believed that Christ had given the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter, who had the power and authority to define doctrines in the church. While all the apostles, and thus all bishops, had authority in the church, it was Peter alone who received the keys, and it was on him that Christ built the foundation of his church. Furthermore, tradition says that Peter founded the church in Rome, and he died there. On this basis, the bishops of Rome were his successors, and as such, they had his unique role and authority passed down to them. With all of that in mind, it's easy to see why this doctrine took center stage at the council. On the one hand, you have the universities calling for a revision of traditional doctrine, and on the other, you have a massively popular movement looking for the Pope to be an infallible leader that could push back the tides of liberalism. From the start, the issue divided the bishops. Soon, three factions emerged. First, you had the majority, who supported defining the doctrine. Then you had the minority, who opposed it outright, and something of a middle group, who perhaps were the most interesting, and they believed that the doctrine of papal infallibility was in fact true, but they just thought this wasn't the time to go about defining it. Among this final group was Newman. Writing from England, he warned that the move would stir unnecessary controversy and risk inflaming tensions. He said, quote, "No impending danger is to be averted, but a great difficulty is to be created." His fears proved prescient. At the heart of the debate was a methodological divide. The majority relied on proof texts and theological authority, the minority from history. Minority figures like Karl Joseph von Hefele, a German bishop and scholar of ecumenical councils, insisted that the historical record simply did not support the claim of an infallible pope. From the condemnation of Pope Honorius to the working of earlier councils themselves, history seemed more adversary than ally. But for the majority, history was not the measure of truth. Bishop Gasser, speaking for them, declared, "The infallibility of the Roman pontiffs is a truth divinely revealed. Therefore, it is impossible that it can ever be proved false by any historical facts." He even goes on to say, "If, however, such facts are brought forward to oppose it, they must themselves be deemed false, insofar as they seem opposed." As the bishops debated day after day, three primary issues came to the fore. First, is infallibility personal to the Pope, or does it apply only to his doctrines? Second, is the Pope's infallibility separate from the Church's infallibility? Third, is the Pope's infallibility absolute, or could his teaching, even infallible ones, be reformed by later councils? This note about councils is really important. If the ultramontanist view of church government focused on centralized authority in the figure of the Pope, the alternative view was known as Gallicanism. While its heyday had passed by the time of the council, Gallicans emphasized the authority of local bishops in their own diocese, autonomy in selecting bishops on a national level, and most importantly, the idea that the decrees of a pope must be ratified by an ecumenical council. While this might be an imperfect analogy, ultramontanism viewed the church as an absolute monarchy, whereas Gallicanism resembled a republic. Once the battle lines were drawn at the council, and really even before the council, the sides dug in their heels. The majority believed infallibility was personal, separate, and absolute, while the minority insisted on the opposite. After a month of debates without much progress, there finally appeared to be light at the end of the tunnel. Cardinal Guidi, a Dominican from the majority, was the first to attempt a real compromise. He gave a speech arguing that infallibility did not extend to the person of the Pope, but only to the act of defining dogma. This infallibility is separate from the Church in the sense that the Church doesn't give him this infallibility, but the Pope is dependent on the Church in the sense that he must consult the bishops before defining dogma. The minority was delighted by this. In fact, there's a story that one of the main bishops from the minority ran up and kissed his hand. He was so excited at the end of this speech. Finally, it seemed there was hope for resolution. But the joy was short-lived. Critically, one person wasn't fond of this proposal. And of all the people to anger, Guidi chose the worst possible one, the Pope. After he had made his speech, Pope Pius IX summoned Guidi and, according to multiple sources, exploded and said, I am tradition. I am the church. It's honestly a scene that feels more reminiscent of a Hollywood movie than a real church council, but the majority of historians affirm that it likely happened, and it marked a turning point. From the beginning, the Pope had promised to remain on the sidelines, and at first, he really did. But by this point, he was becoming increasingly involved behind the scenes. He was giving speeches that made their way into the press, making his views pretty clear, and he even privately threatened to dissolve the council if it didn't define infallibility. The writing was on the wall. Papal infallibility would be defined one way or another. By the final vote, the outcome was all but assured. The minority bishops, many demoralized and disillusioned, quietly exited Rome, hoping to avoid the appearance of outright defiance. Those who remained voted overwhelmingly in favor of Pastor Aeternus. And so, on July 18, 1870, papal infallibility became dogma. The final version of the document stated that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith or morals intending to bind the whole church, he does so infallibly. No council's ratification is needed, no appeal is possible. The majority, of course, were delighted, but there was still a fear that this would lead to schism. And while theologians like Dollinger broke with Rome, the vast majority of bishops eventually assented. The crisis, it seemed, had been contained. But the victory for the Ultramontanists soon took a drastic turn. Within months, Italian troops entered Rome, the papal states fell, the Pope's temporal power was gone. And with it, the rationale for some of the church's absolutist claims began to crumble. Ironically, the doctrine that crowned the Pope's authority coincided with the end of his worldly rule. In the decades that followed, the infallible Pope became a more spiritual figure. Devotion to the papacy soared. Before the council, it had been 150 years since the last Pope was canonized as a saint. For the one before that, you'd have to go back another 100 years. After the council, 3 of the next 10 popes were canonized, and the Pope took on an increasingly important role in the everyday mind of Catholics. Another lasting impact of the council was the centralization of the church. The appointment of bishops specifically, which was formerly shaped by national churches and monarchies, now rested almost entirely in Rome. But if Vatican I seemed to close the door on debates over the church's relationship to the modern world, history had other plans. Less than a century later, Pope John XXIII stunned the world by calling Vatican II, a council not to condemn modernity, but to engage it. Collegiality, ecumenism, and liturgical reform were now on the table. The church was on a brand new path. And yet, Vatican I remained. All right. So here's the thing. Now that we've traced the arc of the council, we've looked at its key figures, its intellectual backdrop, and some really interesting dramatic turning points, I want to take a step back and offer some reflections on the theological implications of this council and the questions that still linger. At this point, I should lay my cards on the table and say, as a Protestant, I really can't help but view some of these issues through Protestant lenses. Nevertheless, I really do approach this with a deep respect for the Catholic tradition. So my goal here isn't to embark on a polemic, but it's really to bring clarity, to assess the Council's claims on their own terms and consider how they interact with Protestant convictions. Let's begin with Dei Filius, and we'll start at the start. The decree opens with a sweeping condemnation of Protestantism, assigning to it a responsibility for pretty much everything it saw wrong in the modern world. That ranged from pantheism, atheism, materialism, and a general disregard for Scripture. To my ears, that assessment feels somewhat heavy-handed. And look, I'm not alone in that reaction. Some of the Council Fathers expressed similar misgivings. Bishop Joseph Strassmayer, for instance, pointed out that figures like Voltaire certainly played a role and that many Protestants lived exemplary Christian lives. His comments, however, were not warmly received by his brother bishops. However, they did age remarkably well. I mean, by the time of Vatican II, the Catholic Church's approach toward Protestantism had radically changed. Instead of blaming Protestantism for all that is bad in the world, Vatican II took a lot more generous and, I think, accurate approach. It recognized the value and insight present in other Christian traditions and even in non-Christian faiths without compromising on its Catholic identity. That seems like a really genuine step forward to me. That kind of posture doesn't have to dilute the truth. It recognizes that truth is more important than tribalism, though. In this respect, Vatican I very much was not the final word. And I think that's a good thing. In the second chapter, the council affirms that God, the source and end of all things, can be known with certainty from the consideration of created things. Now, that phrase, with certainty, raises some real philosophical questions. While I wouldn't deny that reason can offer us good evidence for God's existence, I'm not convinced that certainty, at least in the strict philosophical sense, is the right word here. That said, I don't think the real point of the passage is to extol reason, but to actually affirm the necessity and sufficiency of divine revelation. In other words, it's important to remember that Dei Filius was responding to rationalism, not promoting it. What I do find more concerning, and not surprisingly, is the Council's claim that the interpretation of Scripture belongs solely to the Church, and that no one is permitted to interpret Scripture contrary to the Church's decrees or the unanimous consensus of the Fathers. Now, I want to affirm, the Church is the ordinary context for interpreting Scripture. The Scriptures were given to the people of God, the Church, not to isolated individuals. But if the Church errs, as I believe is possible, and of course the bishops would disagree with me, then the faithful must be permitted, with fear and trembling, to appeal to Scripture itself, even against the prevailing ecclesial interpretations. Now, I'm not saying that's a license to interpretive anarchy, but it's a recognition of the Church's fallibility. As for this idea of the unanimous consensus of the Fathers, it's an admirable principle in theory, but it's really difficult in practice. Even moral unanimity, which is to say the vast majority but not absolutely everyone, is really hard to establish on many interpretive questions, on like almost all of them. And even when you have that type of unanimity, strictly speaking, it's not an automatic indication of truth, even if it's a powerful and humbling witness and is something that we should absolutely reckon with seriously. There's still at least conceptually different ideas, unanimity and truthfulness. The final chapter of Dei Filius focuses on the harmony of faith and reason, a general theme that I wholeheartedly affirm. While I'm not fond of the text's polemical attitude toward the Academy, I happen to, generally speaking, quite like the Academy, the heart of the message rings true. Faith and reason are not enemies. Done rightly, they're allies, and that's really good. But then at the end comes a line that gives me pause. It's one we already looked at, that the meaning of sacred dogma is ever to be maintained, which has once been declared by Holy Mother Church, and there must never be any abandonment of this sense under the pretext or in the name of a more profound understanding. This statement poses real difficulties in two ways. First, there's the historical question of whether or not the Catholic Church has, in practice, maintained the same meaning of dogmas over time. I would argue, in fact, I have argued on this channel, that on issues like salvation outside the Church, the Catholic Church has changed the meaning of dogmas. So at the level of internal consistency, there seems to be challenges. And this would be the standard Protestant critique. The second difficulty, though, is whether or not this statement is good theology. I'll go out on a limb here and say that I think this statement actually might be too restrictive. I understand what the Council was trying to do. It wants to preserve the integrity of the faith against relativism and redefinition. And that is a danger, right? Where you have churchmen saying, oh yeah, I totally believe in the resurrection, if by resurrection you mean this myth or this historical archetype, when in reality it's like, no, what we mean by resurrection is bodily resurrection. But I think this general approach can also risk ignoring the complex historical processes by which doctrine matures and our understanding of it matures. It's one thing to say that doctrine doesn't change. It's another to insist that no further articulation ever modifies the meaning. And I guess I just suppose I'm more comfortable with living in the messiness of history than pretending it isn't there. And for what it's worth, I think that's the direction Catholic theology took after the Council. The view of theology became much less about static truths divorced from history, and much more about viewing theology as grounded, at least in part, in history and therefore always open to deeper insights. For the ressourcement theologians like Hans Urs von Balthasar, who I much prefer to the neo-scholastics, when investigating dogmas of the past, we must separate the historical contingencies that formulated the language from the trans-historical truth and the intention of the authors. For Balthasar, theology is always being limited by language, and that's okay. But we must recognize that and always be open to expressing it in new language that might help us better understand it. So there are my thoughts on Dei Filius. But the real star of the show, of course, is Pastor Aeternus. It's the Council's defining moment. In Pastor Aeternus, we encounter the familiar biblical proof texts for the papacy that are drawn from Matthew 16, Luke 22, and John 21. To be honest, I find these less than convincing as direct support for the claims made in Pastor Aeternus, or at least sufficient support, as O'Malley, who I should pause to give a shout out to. John W. O'Malley, in his fantastic book, Vatican I, The Council and the Making of the Ultramontane Church, has been like the foundation of this video, along with other research. But this really, if you want to know about the council, especially its history and its development, this is where you go. It'll be linked in the description. Huge shout out to him. He's a Catholic historian and just does a wonderful job of piecing it all together. But for O'Malley, the document's greatest weakness was its historical naivete. And I think he's right. That doesn't mean the document was intellectually lazy. Far from it. I mean, they're putting real thought into this, and great debate went into it. But it often bypasses historical nuance in favor of sweeping theological and historical claims. Part of understanding the verses that are marshaled forth as proof of the papacy requires we understand how they've been interpreted and implemented in the history of the church. And that history is far more complex than simply waving a proof text can make it seem. Now, since the Council, I think the Vatican has done admirable work with the Eastern Orthodox churches studying this issue together and revealing that the history is a lot messier and complex than we thought, that the understanding hasn't always been shared between the East and West and at all times. I think that's fantastic, and you can see this in the Ravenna, Chieti, and Alexandria documents chronicling the history of the papal primacy, which I'll try to link as well. In place of this historical nuance, Vatican I seems to paint with very broad brushes. Of course, conciliar documents are going to give us conclusions rather than showing all the steps and how they got there, and that's totally fine. But when Pastor Aeternus begins to assert that papal infallibility represents the belief that is constant throughout church history, it's making a claim that's open to scrutiny. And honestly, it's a hard claim to defend when put to the test. Even bearing in mind the idea that Vatican I's language that this has always been held doesn't mean that no one ever disagreed, it still seems to paper over the divergent understandings that can be found both in different times and places of church history. While the early church certainly honored the Bishop of Rome, there's a difference between primacy and infallibility. The former has broad historical support. The latter is more complicated. Now, of course, Newman's theory of development is meant to bridge that gap, and perhaps it does. But for me, it feels more like watching one seed among many flourish because of particular historical winds, rather than seeing the inevitable flower of one tree planted by the apostles that flowered into the papacy. Now, maybe that's still compatible with the Catholic view, but it feels like a much less triumphalist reading of history and one that recognizes the real complexity at play here. To really get in the weeds, not to go back to gardening metaphors, we have to turn to the three adjectives that defined papal infallibility: personal, separate, and absolute. Now, the best way to understand what the council meant by this is to read Bishop Gasser's Relatio, which you can find in this book, The Gift of Infallibility, which has also been super helpful in making this video. Now, the Relatio was initially given as a speech on the council floor that stretched on nearly 4 hours, which is some serious stamina. It's a really careful and qualified theological exposition that defines papal infallibility as personal, not in the sense that the Pope is always infallible, but that the Pope, by nature of his office when speaking ex cathedra, is. Separate, meaning the Pope doesn't require the consent of the bishops for a pronouncement to be binding. And absolute, though not in the strict sense of unlimited power or always applicable, in which case only God is absolutely infallible, but that such declarations of the Pope, when made under the protection of infallibility, are irreformable and beyond appeal. To Gasser's credit, these are really good and balanced definitions. The doctrine is honestly a lot more modest than many Protestants assume, but that's not to say that it doesn't still have huge implications. And the thing about these nuanced definitions here that makes papal infallibility really tricky is it's rather difficult to tell exactly when the Pope is speaking under the conditions of infallibility, which Reverend James T. O'Connor talks about at the end of this book and goes through some really good stuff on how you would recognize that, but it's complicated. Let's get into these adjectives, though. The idea that infallibility is personal raises questions about how easily that could be misunderstood or abused. I mean, Pius IX's exclamation, "I am the tradition, I am the church," is a bone-chilling example of what can happen when theological nuance is lost. Again, I'm not saying that's what the council taught, that leads to that kind of understanding, but it certainly could be interpreted that way and I think has to be guarded against. The claim that the Pope's infallibility is separate from the Church's infallibility also feels a bit theologically precarious. It runs the risk of at least appearing to create a fourth office in the church, distinct from bishop, priest, and deacon, and that blurs the ecclesiological line between pope and church. Now, in my opinion, I think the Gallican view requiring agreement between the pope and an ecumenical council seems superior. Finally, the insertion that infallible teachings are absolute and therefore irreformable cuts against a core Protestant conviction and one that's really shaped my thinking. That is the idea that the church is semper reformanda, ecclesia semper reformanda, which means that the church is always in need of reformation. That's not because truth changes, but because our understanding of it can deepen and our expressions of it are always caught up in our cultural context and the limits of human language and our own sinfulness. Now, once again, I think figures like Balthasar represent a move away from Vatican I here, but a move in the right direction. Theology, as the study of God, is defined by its object, God. And the nature of God demands that we recognize that he is inexhaustible and finite words could never circumscribe who he is. That's not to say theology is hopeless, right? Thanks to God revealing himself, we can speak truly about him, but never exhaustively. Our definitions are always analogical. They gesture toward mystery, and for that reason, I worry that the absoluteness of papal infallibility at least runs the risk of tying the church to finite, incomplete expressions of mystery that are in need of better clarification and nuance and time. Now, of course, perhaps this fear is well heeded given the direction of Catholic theology after Vatican I, but it raises questions about the council itself then. Which leads me to my conclusion. In the end, Vatican I was a council shaped by the pressures of its time. It was reactive, defensive, and determined to draw hard boundaries in an age of uncertainty. In a sense, though, being a council of its time is precisely what it didn't want to be. And yet, I really can't think of a better way of understanding it. Now look, even as a Protestant, I can appreciate that the bishops at the council needed to respond to the really pressing needs and demands of their day. But those challenges and the tools they had at their disposal to respond to the challenges don't need to be enshrined in theology forever. And yet the story isn't over. Maybe they won't be. Vatican II showed that the church could reopen old questions, reframe past emphases, and seek reconciliation over confrontation. In that sense, the most important legacy of Vatican I may not be its declarations or its anathemas, as much as those make me bristle, but the debates that it continues to provoke. Perhaps the real and lingering question about the council is the one that asks, can we let Vatican I be a council that is a product of its time, that was shaped and limited by the historical moment in which it took place, even if that's not what the council wanted to be, and it wanted to be a council that proclaimed a timeless truth? It's wrestling with questions like that have shaped and will continue to shape Catholic theology moving forward and will have incredibly important ramifications for how Protestants and Catholics can relate.